You, trash like that, dared to talk back to me? One blow. Swift, hard, precise. The old but clean SUV instantly turned into scrap metal before everyone's eyes. He smashed the car of a black woman in broad daylight, without reason, simply because he thought she wasn't worthy of being believed. He laughed as he called it procedure, but less than 1 hour later, the entire police department scrambled into an emergency meeting, shaken by the true identity of the woman whose vehicle he had destroyed. A badge had slipped from her jacket pocket, just one, and it was enough to rip the mask off a system that had long bowed to prejudice. Do you still believe justice comes from the courts? Or are you clear-headed enough to realize it begins the moment someone chooses not to look away? Washington, D.C., a quiet Monday morning. Sunlight cut through damp leaves and swept over a silent row of cars behind District Court No. 4. The breeze carried the scent of wet brick, fresh asphalt, and half-drunk coffee from a cart 2 blocks away. Everything seemed normal, so normal that no one guessed this would be the start of a conflict that would last a lifetime. An old silver sedan pulled into the far corner. The paint was chipped, the bumper dented. A black woman stepped out. Slim, hoodie faded at the cuffs, no makeup, backpack on one shoulder. She zipped up her hoodie, covered her shirt collar, then opened the trunk. Inside were just a brown box and a folder bag. No one knew who she was, but in a place full of ties, suits, and name tags, she felt out of place. Not for what she did, but because she didn't match what this space was used to seeing. About 20 meters away, 2 young officers leaned against a patrol car. One tapped his baton. The other sipped coffee. They didn't flinch when the car arrived, but both stared as she stepped out. No words, no signals, just a shared look, clear enough that she noticed. One whispered something, the other smirked. That silence said everything. She locked the trunk, holding the box to her chest. Her eyes paused for a second on the 2 men, not to challenge, not to avoid, just long enough to show she saw them and knew why. They didn't move, but one set his cup down, the other rested a hand near his holster. No threat, no reason, just that quiet urge to control what doesn't fit, and sometimes that's all it takes for something to go wrong. She turned away and continued walking toward the side entrance of the building. Her shadow stretched across the cold gray pavement, not exactly firm, not defeated either, just someone heading to work on what seemed like an ordinary morning. But something shifted in that moment, in the minds of the 2 officers, in the eyes watching from a 3rd-floor window, and in her own heart, still unaware that the car she had just driven there would not be taking her home in one piece. Footsteps echoed on the worn concrete, not running, but deliberate. She didn't turn, but she could feel the movement behind her, coming closer. As she stepped onto the first stair leading up to the ground level, a voice barked out, dry, rough, the kind used to giving orders. Pop the trunk. She stopped, didn't turn, just tilted her head slightly to the left, as if checking she had heard correctly. After a few seconds of silence, she turned around. Same small frame and the worn hoodie, but her eyes were no longer just cautious. They were measured, aware, and ready. "I haven't broken any laws, sir. May I ask the reason for the search?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a line drawn beneath a legal appeal, clear, firm, and impossible to ignore. That simple question shook the balance that the officers were trying to keep to stay in control. She didn't yell. She didn't back down. She just stood straight, holding the cardboard box to her chest, eyes locked on the man who had issued the command. The young officer paused, unused to being questioned, then let out a short laugh, crooked and sharp, laced with something everyone could smell even if it wasn't said aloud: contempt. People who behave usually cooperate, you know. He glanced at his partner, pleased to see him shrug in agreement, then looked back at her, longer this time. His eyes scanned from her face to her sneakers, then to the box in her arms, as if every part of her signaled something out of place. His voice dropped, the kind that didn't need to threaten out loud to make the threat clear. "But if you want to be difficult," he didn't finish. The smirk and slow raise of one brow said the rest. She didn't flinch. A breeze lifted the edge of her coat, revealing a silver analog watch on her left wrist. Not flashy, but refined. Something a trained eye would know wasn't cheap. But neither officer looked at the watch. They looked at her posture, her gaze, and felt something more unsettling than refusal, the sense that they were being unreasonable while trying to prove they were right. The courtyard drew tight like a wire about to snap. No one said more, but every glance and breath etched an invisible map of risk, where each path led to conflict. At the center stood a black woman, arms around a cardboard box, facing two white officers who were silently asking themselves, who is she, and why won't she bow her head like the others? The morning crowd had yet to arrive. The only sounds were the distant hum of a street sweeper and the faint screech of tires on concrete. But across that small courtyard, a different kind of tension began to surface, not through noise, but through fixed stares and shrinking distance. The officer who had issued the command moved toward the silver car. He said nothing more, but his eyes kept shifting between her and the vehicle, scanning for anything that could be used against her. He leaned close, pressed his face to the driver's side window, one hand shielding his forehead to peer inside, where there were only a few folders, a brown handbag, and a neatly placed pair of low heels. The scene resembled less a procedural check and more a visual search, a desperate attempt to justify suspicion that had arrived long before any evidence. The second officer didn't come closer but stood behind the car, eyes locked on the woman's body. It wasn't the look of caution or analysis. It was the look that sought to label. Every breath, every still gesture was filtered through a preset script. Tension means hiding something. Silence means abnormal. Any reaction means resistance. She stayed still on the steps, keeping a clear distance. One arm held the cardboard box, while the other slowly reached into her coat pocket to retrieve a wallet. She opened it and calmly presented her driver's license and registration, unsolicited. She simply held them out, as if to end the staring game, as if to say, "I know what you're going to ask for, so here." The papers were extended toward the officer near the car, but he didn't take them, didn't reach, didn't step back either. He just glanced, smirked, and said, "Anyone can print that these days." The words came out thoughtlessly but spread like oil, sticking to every silent space. She didn't lower her arm, didn't insist, just held the documents mid-air, waiting to see whether he would face the proof or keep searching for something that matched the prejudice already in his head. He turned away, because clearly it wasn't about the papers. It was about her, made her feel watched, judged, and separated from everything around her, like something foreign, suspicious, even while standing in a public lot on a bright morning. A crack had started between them, invisible but real, not from what was said, but from the choice not to touch the papers. In a world where suspicion arrives before truth, documents are ritual, not protection. She withdrew her hand, slipping the wallet back into her coat. No anger, no smile, just steady calm. She knew any expression could be twisted by someone looking for a reason. A security guard entered from the side gate, eyes on his phone, unaware of the storm thickening nearby. His steps only made the space feel more cut off. Just her, the two officers, and a silver car examined like a crime scene. She sensed this wouldn't end here, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she hadn't acted like someone used to being controlled. The officer by the car leaned back, one hand on his hip, eyes shifting to her. He moved slowly, as if fully in charge of how far this would go. He glanced at the car again, not to check it, but to judge her by it. Scratched paint, dented bumper, worn edges. He smirked. "Driving this? Not a lawyer, huh?" It wasn't quite a joke, but not serious enough to call out. If she reacted, he'd say he was kidding. But everyone knew it wasn't a joke. It was a verdict, a way of saying, "You don't belong here." She stood still, head slightly tilted, eyes locked on him. Then she spoke, voice calm and clear. "And you must have skipped the Fourth Amendment." The moment froze. He squinted. His partner shifted, then held back. It wasn't the content. It was that a black woman in a hoodie, driving a beat-up car, had cited the law with confidence. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches, requires probable cause. A simple fact, but to men used to power it struck hard. One officer's jaw twitched. The other stepped closer, shrinking the space, as if presence could override what had just been said. This was no longer a conversation. It was a power shift. Words became threats. The law, instead of a neutral ground, became defiance. They didn't hear the Constitution. They heard a challenge, and that was enough to label her difficult, dangerous, in need of control. She stayed silent, not because she had nothing more to say, but because she knew they had stopped listening. And when someone no longer fits the frame, power doesn't refocus. It distorts. The sky stayed blue, but something darker settled below. The fear of men in power, facing someone who knew the law and wasn't afraid to speak it. Another breeze swept through, scattering a few dry leaves beneath the bench. None of the three moved. She stood tall, arms still holding the cardboard box to her chest like a final, fragile shield. Her eyes no longer needed to appear steady. They simply were. The officer on the left reached behind his bag. In a fast, cold motion, he pulled a baton from his belt without a word. A dry, sharp sound cracked as the metal snapped open, slicing through the air. "Turn around! Hands on the trunk, now!" His voice was firm, but something in his eyes betrayed hesitation, as if even he wasn't sure whether this was protocol or the reaction of a man losing control. She didn't move. In that instant, she looked at the baton, then back at his face. No fear, no challenge, just the focused awareness of someone who had read too many case files, heard too many testimonies, seen too many incidents born in moments just like this. "I refuse. Without a valid warrant, I have the right not to be touched." The reply was calm, clear, and unwavering. In a just world, this is how citizens confront abuse, with the law. But here and now, the law wasn't with the one who knew it. It was with the one holding the weapon. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The shout exploded, not because she resisted, but because she didn't bow, because she didn't apologize for existing, because she refused to play the role others assigned her. The second officer, who had stayed back until now, stepped forward. "Trash like you dare talk back to me!" His boots hit the concrete hard. The tension had shifted from suspicion to open threat. It wasn't hands yet, but it was in the voice, the look, the way two badge-wearing men closed in on a small black woman in a quiet parking lot early in the morning. She still didn't move. "I'm someone you can't even imagine." The words came out soft as breath, but in their minds they struck like an explosion, an echo of something too big to measure. Not because it was grand, but because it flipped the roles. They thought they were the ones asking questions, but now they were actors unsure of the script, in a scene that someone else had started watching. The officer with the baton stepped closer, grip tightening. He wasn't used to being questioned, to facing defiance, to standing before a woman he couldn't instantly control. His jaw clenched, and his arm began to tense, readying for a strike. The second officer turned on his radio, not to call for backup, not to de-escalate, but to log something vague, a placeholder that would let them tell this story on their terms. No one stood between the man with the weapon and the woman standing still. Maybe the courtyard was still too empty. Maybe no one believed it would happen until it did. One strike. Sharp, hard, precise. The metal baton smashed through the windshield like it was paper thin. The sound was not glass sharp, but low and final, like a verdict delivered without words. Cracks spidered from the center, splinters hanging in the air before falling on the hood, the pavement, the edge of her shoe. She didn't flinch. He didn't stop. Another blow landed on the side door, louder, scraping through air and metal. A dent caved inward, deep, warped, and permanent. It wasn't just property damage. It was violence carved into steel. Still, she said nothing. Then came the kick, hitting the side panel hard enough to rock the frame. He no longer looked like a cop, just a man angry at losing control. No words, just ragged breath, red eyes, and a rhythm that no longer fit any official training. Minutes ago, he had been on duty. Now he was only swinging. The cardboard box in her arms shook as the car jolted. The file was inside tilted, a few papers slipped slightly out, But she held on as if it were the only anchor in the chaos. From a short distance away, a child whimpered. A little boy, clutching his mother's arm, stood frozen beside an SUV. The woman pulled him back, eyes wide. No one screamed. No one intervened. But the air had shifted. A small crowd began to gather, drawn by the sounds of shattering glass, metal strikes, and rage no one dared name. A middle-aged man, maybe a worker, maybe a passerby, pulled out his phone. His hands trembled, but he held them up. The recording started. Just then, something small hit the concrete. Not glass, but metal. Thin, scratched, faded at the edge. A badge. She bent down and picked it up, as if recovering something long familiar, once dropped in a courtroom. But this time, it had fallen in a parking lot. After 3 strikes, in front of 2 officers and a few silent onlookers, unsure how to react. The surface still bore faint lettering: United States District Court, Federal Judge, Amara H. Cole. No one else saw the words at that moment, except her. But the feel of the badge in her palm, the brush of her thumb over the worn edge, was enough to steady her spine. Not for the title, but for what it had taken to earn it. The years, the barriers, the distance she had traveled just to have this right, now trampled by force. Around her the air remained thick, but the baton had stopped. The violence had paused, not from awareness, but because something in her eyes had shifted. No longer just defiance, it was the gaze of someone who had picked herself up from the wreckage and knew that even if her car had been struck, even if power had threatened her body, her name had not yet been erased from justice. Not all violence happens in plain sight. Some of it moves through words, looks, and quiet authority woven into systems, where no one records, no one screams. These acts don't bruise skin or shatter glass, but they can break a person from the inside out. When the final blow ended, the parking lot was no longer a place for cars. It had become a scene of fractured power, where a woman neither cried nor resisted, yet was still treated as if she were about to do something wrong. And because she didn't collapse, as expected, something more unsettling began to take shape. The fear that she might be someone they couldn't control. The man with the phone kept filming. He said nothing, didn't step closer, but one officer noticed. Their faces shifted, no longer triumphant, but alert, like someone who realized they'd just revealed too much. "Put the phone down. Delete the clip. Now." The command came low but firm. The man's grip tightened. Eyes steady, lips pressed. He didn't obey right away, and in that brief hesitation one quiet action was completed. The footage backed itself up to a cloud account. Another officer stepped forward, hand resting near his holster, applying pressure without words. The man nodded, thumbed off the camera, but didn't delete. What burned in his eyes wasn't just fear, it was anger. And that anger, like silent fuel, would keep burning after she was taken away. She was escorted to the patrol car. No handcuffs, but she didn't need them because being taken without having broken the law was already the ultimate restraint. The 2 officers, now wearing their usual smirks, opened the back door. The taller one bent slightly, smiled, and spoke gently, as if comforting a friend. "Don't worry, just a few hours. Quick check, then you'll be on your way." On its own, the tone could sound polite, but here it echoed like mockery, sugar-wrapped, as if the baton, the glass, and the denied rights had never happened, as if this were routine, as if they had every right, and she, whoever she was, still had to go. She didn't reply. She just got into the back seat. The door shut with a dull thud. Through the fogged divider, she could still see the lot, where shards of glass remained on the ground, where the man with the phone backed away, eyes fixed on his screen, and where a child, held in his mother's arms, watched the police car pull away with a look that didn't understand, but sensed something was wrong. She wasn't thinking about the story she might tell. She didn't need to tell it. Ever since the baton struck and the scratched badge slipped from her pocket, the story had begun to speak for itself, and for the first time after years of presiding over police cases, she fully understood the feeling of losing control, not from being struck, but from realizing no one thought they needed to ask before striking. The car rolled out of the lot. In her lap, the faded judicial badge rested in her palm. In a city where the law was more decoration than protection, she had just become the living answer to a question the system never dared ask. If justice forgets even those who know the law, then who is safe? District 3 Police Headquarters stood in a blocky gray structure. Concrete walls and windows sun-faded to a dull blur. A silver nameplate was bolted to the front wall, gleaming under midday light. People still spoke of the place with official pride, an administrative center of law enforcement. But that morning, when the patrol car arrived, no one came out to meet her. No one asked questions, just a door opening and two men gesturing for her to step out, as if everything was routine. The lobby felt cold, not from the air conditioning, but from the looks of those who had grown used to the idea of suspects. No one asked her name. No one asked why she had been brought in. She bore no visible injuries, no handcuffs, no shouting, and, for that, she passed through the intake like another vague entry in a system trained to judge by appearances. A desk officer glanced up. Older, salt-and-pepper hair, more seasoned than the ones who had smashed her car. He said nothing at first, just looked. His gaze didn't settle on the hoodie or rush past, like others who saw a black woman out of place. His eyes stopped briefly at her hands, clutched around something still held close. Then he spoke. Low, almost privately. "Do you need to call someone?" She turned to him. No smile, no nod. But her reply was firm enough to be heard by the intake clerk behind him. No, they'll already know. No need to say who, no need to say what, but the way she said it unsettled more than any threat could, because it didn't come from anger. It came from certainty, a quiet that wasn't hopeless, but grounded in this truth. What belongs to justice will, eventually, find its way back. She was asked to sit in a hard plastic chair beside the waiting room B3. Above her hung a large sign, deep blue background, bold white letters across 3 lines: service, justice, community, protection. The familiar slogan appeared in every precinct nationwide, a constant reminder of professional duty. But seated beneath it, dressed in ordinary clothes, a dented cardboard box on her lap, and a faded silver badge in her hand, the words felt hollow, cold in their emptiness. Beneath her feet, on the rough tile floor, a few small shards of glass still clung to her pant cuffs, mixed with dust and grit from the patrol car's floor. They were no longer sharp, but they still caught the overhead lights with piercing reflections. No one noticed them. No one considered sweeping them up. In this system, a small break meant nothing unless it drew blood. She looked down. A larger shard clung to the hem of her left pant leg, gleaming silver. She brushed it free, slowly, then bent to pick it up and held it beside the badge in her palm, as if the two pieces belonged together, as if what had shattered was not just her car, but the way the system treated those who didn't fit its default mold. No one came to check on her. No one tracked the minutes she sat there. But during those 12 silent minutes, something shifted, not within the system, but among those who had started watching the video now uploaded. Elsewhere, just a few blocks away, the first headline had already appeared on social media. They smashed a woman's car, without knowing she was a federal judge. Behind the door of the small office where she sat waiting, a quiet series of administrative steps began. A desk officer was instructed to run a quick background check on the woman brought in from the courthouse parking lot. He showed no reaction, just opened the internal browser, logged into the state-level identity system, and entered the basic fields: name, date of birth, driver's license, license plate. After a few seconds, the screen displayed a simple, unsettling message: no records found. He tried again, this time with more details, including the ID number from the documents she had provided. The result didn't change. No judicial records, no clear address history. No data connected to anyone by that name, at least not in the current state database. He frowned, not because he thought she was faking. He had seen this before, rare but not unheard of. Newly appointed federal personnel often fell into a delay gap between systems. State databases did not automatically sync with federal records. unless explicitly requested. And if the individual had never worked in a state office, then technically they didn't exist to those searching for them. What worried him more than the blank screen was the look on the faces of the two officers who had brought her in. They leaned against the hallway wall, speaking in low voices. But he still caught pieces. No file, huh? Makes sense. Doesn't look like anyone important. Inside the office, she remained silent. The cardboard box sat beside her chair. Her fingers still held the metal badge, tilted just enough for the overhead light to catch the faded words, United States District Court. She knew exactly what was happening, and that made her feel cold. Not from fear, but from realization. A real person with a real title and real authority could be treated as if she didn't exist, just because she didn't show up in the right system. The system, with its servers, networks, and statutes, still contained a lag, and in that lag, personal authority became void. Someone like her, when not correctly displayed, could be handled like anyone else deemed suspicious. She didn't need to be attacked physically. A disruption in data was enough to nullify her presence in the eyes of local law. The desk officer finally stood and tapped lightly on the glass panel where she sat. When she looked up, he didn't enter right away. He spoke through the glass. "I need to call upstairs to verify a few things. Maybe you were just federally appointed?" She opened her wallet and showed the badge again. Not for validation, but to remind herself. "I worked for years to earn this, and because one line of data hasn't been entered correctly, they could strip its meaning in a single morning." The officer nodded without another word. As he turned away, she heard his shoe scrape a small shard of glass under the desk. The sound was soft, but to her, perfectly captured the moment. A system stepping over the damage it had caused without even noticing. The young officer from earlier was the first to re-enter after the desk officer left. He wasn't grinning like before, but there was still a faint trace of smugness, the look of someone who thought he had just flipped a winning card. "System checked, you're not in it," he said, louder than necessary, not to inform, but to reclaim the upper hand he'd nearly lost back in the parking lot. That line, delivered in a room silent behind glass, landed like a verdict without a courtroom. He stared at her for a moment, then shrugged as if the matter were settled. His reasoning was simple, and that made it dangerous. If the system didn't recognize her, then she wasn't anyone. No name, no rights. No data, no identity. In his world, a person only existed when a server confirmed it. Everything else, speech, paper, conduct, even presence, was irrelevant. What he wanted was a box with a name. What she needed was recognition rooted in fact. But the fact didn't flash on his screen, so to him, it didn't exist. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound, its corners worn. It wasn't a journal. It wasn't where she recorded laws. It was the place she wrote things never meant to be sent, only kept. She flipped to the nearest blank page. In deep blue ink, her slanted handwriting appeared slowly. "I exist, but not enough to be recognized in the very place I serve." She rested the notebook on her knee, fingers lightly over the cover, as if that sentence was the only thing keeping her from vanishing inside the tightening map of power. Outside in the hallway, another officer walked past. He didn't look in, didn't ask anything. His steps were quick, even, practiced, as if he'd passed hundreds of people before, all filed into the same category, someone being held for potential non-compliance. She looked at the pen tip just lifted from the page. The ink hadn't fully dried, catching the glare of the fluorescent light above. She didn't need to think more about what she had written. It wasn't new. It was simply the next sentence in a truth she, like many before her, had long understood. To exist does not guarantee being seen the right way. She had never thought of her title as a shield, but she had believed that once inside the system she wouldn't have to stand on the border between appointed and untrusted. This morning, the system proved the opposite. It wasn't that she wasn't qualified, it was that she hadn't yet been named in the language this place recognized. That is how the system keeps the surface clear. not by correcting the wrong, but by ignoring the presence of those not yet fully accepted. A kind of erasure, no crossing out required, just absence from the entry field. On the computer screen outside the room, the search bar remained open. The words "no match, found," repeated like a coded rejection. But inside that quiet room, another sentence, unrecorded in any database, stood firm as a declaration. She had been here, and the fact that no one confirmed it didn't make it any less real. On the 6th floor of a glass building, less than 15 minutes' drive from the police station, but a world apart in power, sat the regional office of the Federal Judicial Personnel Coordination Bureau. That morning, everything ran as usual. The coffee machine hummed, windows cracked open, let in the breeze, and the sound of keyboards kept time like an invisible engine at work, until a quiet voice rose from the desk near the window. "Wait, that's Amara." The speaker was Kayla Martinez, Senior Coordination Assistant, responsible for monitoring newly appointed personnel and updating judicial records across local jurisdictions. Her screen showed a video quickly spreading on social media. The title, "Police Smash Woman's Car Outside District Court, She Doesn't Fight Back." Kayla wasn't easily shaken, but in those 17 seconds, she recognized the name that wasn't spoken but impossible to mistake, Amara H. Cole. Her face turned in profile, hair neatly pinned, hands holding a cardboard box, was unmistakable. They had worked together for 2 years at the Federal Internal Audit Office. They had investigated misconduct cases in distant states. Kayla had signed the paperwork confirming Amara's appointment as a federal judge just 3 weeks ago. She picked up the phone immediately. The first call didn't come from a spokesperson, not from a director. It came from Kayla, someone who knew how the system worked and exactly where to press to make it stop. In under 3 minutes, an internal call reached the city police chief's office. At the station, the duty officer answered the phone. The caller's voice wasn't loud, but sharp and clear. "Put me through to the chief. Federal, high priority." On the 2nd floor, the police chief was reading the preliminary report about the parking lot incident, written by the 2 officers involved. He hadn't reached the end of the first sentence when the desk phone rang. When he picked up, the first words he heard weren't a request. They were a directive. "The person detained is a federal judge. We are verifying the file. Cease all action, maintain current status. Forward all internal reports immediately." The voice on the line belonged to the Deputy Chief Inspector of the Federal Judiciary. The tone wasn't harsh, but it carried the cold precision of someone long accustomed to giving directives in politically charged situations. Nothing excessive, but nothing wrong either. The police chief didn't speak for a few seconds. He looked back at the open report. The first line read, "Suspect is female, approximately 35 years old, no legal records found in state system." He folded the report shut. Less than 5 minutes later, the phone rang in the Internal Affairs office. "Emergency call, halt all actions, maintain current conditions, document each step since detainment. No one touches the original file." The head of Internal Affairs hung up, then glanced at the wall clock. It was only 9:17, too early for an internal investigation. But some mistakes happen fast enough that the system is left with only 2 responses: cover it immediately or pretend it was always aware. This time, it was too late for either. The 3rd floor of the precinct was quiet. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just sealed offices, neat desks, and senior officers walking past one another in silence, their footsteps heavier than they led on. Here, information didn't move through intercoms, but through glances and printed pages as sharp as blades. Once the federal call ended, an urgent memo arrived at the operations office. Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Ralston was the first to read it. He had served over 20 years, handled federal cases involving high-ranking personnel, but rarely saw a directive stamped with all 3 red decor flags: urgent, internal, no media disclosure. He pulled the case file from the shelf. The report on the morning incident in the parking lot came with traffic camera images and a handwritten detainment note by the 2 young officers. Everything looked tidy. The subject approached for suspicious behavior near a secure zone. No violent reaction. No resistance. Brought in under administrative protocol. One note stood out. No record in state public service system. Identity unconfirmed. Edmund's hand paused. He flipped to the first page and read the name. Amara H. Cole. For a moment, everything he knew about the system cracked like glass under pressure. That name was not unfamiliar, not vague. It couldn't be. No, it can't. He repeated the name under his breath, this time as if to confirm he had read it correctly. His hand trembled slightly as he opened his computer and logged into the federal personnel database. It took a few seconds for the system to load, but once the result appeared, he nearly forgot where he was. Amara H. Cole, United States District Judge, appointed 3 weeks ago, assigned Judicial District Number 3, the very jurisdiction he oversaw. His throat went dry, not from personal panic, but from the understanding that the woman currently in their custody, unchecked and unverified, was the lawful representative of a judicial authority higher than the very office holding her. Worse still, she hadn't declared it, hadn't made a call, hadn't invoked her title. Someone like that, if they chose silence, wasn't doing so from weakness, but because they knew when truth would speak for itself. Down on the first floor, Hamada remained in the same seat. Her posture hadn't changed since her arrival. The small notebook rested in her lap, her left hand holding the cardboard box, her right folding the faded silver badge back into her coat. She hadn't asked the time, hadn't requested a lawyer, hadn't demanded to see a superior. She knew the machinery had begun to move, not through her, but through others. People who weren't here, but who were now seeing the events unfold via phones, emails, and internal networks. One call had gone out, and from that point, the entire system had been placed on hold. No one dared take another step. Every sound in the waiting room became sharper. The scratch of a pen, the clicking keyboard at the front desk, shoes shifting lightly on tile, and somewhere, farther off, the whine of an ambulance siren, unrelated but echoing a different pulse, urgent, unstable. She looked up at the digital screen showing pending file numbers. One of those numbers was hers, but the system was being forced to acknowledge what it had failed to check. The woman they believed had no record, no identity, had every right to make them stop. Quietly, she was making the very place that had dismissed her sit down, not with yelling, not with fury, but with a presence that could not be erased. The news didn't break through traditional media. There were no reporters outside the police station, no urgent broadcasts. It started with a phone video. 17 seconds, slightly shaky, the main subject's face unclear, but the sound of shattering glass was unmistakable, and right after the image of a black woman standing still, not resisting, beside a dented silver car. The title chosen by the uploader was not inflammatory. It simply read, "Police smash a woman's car because she didn't look right." The quotation marks around "look right" weren't for irony. They made it clear this wasn't an isolated act, but a pattern. Behavior justified by an invisible standard that society quietly applies to those who seem out of place. The clip spread faster than expected. Within 1 hour, it appeared simultaneously on Twitter, TikTok, and Reddit. No one needed to know who the woman was. No one needed a full view of the officer's face. What shocked viewers was the calm of the one who struck and the stillness of the one who was struck. A woman didn't fight back. A car was destroyed, and no one spoke up until someone recorded it. The question filling the comment section wasn't, "Who is she?" but, if no one had filmed this, how far would it have gone? That question ignited a new wave of outrage, not explosive like fire, but spreading like oil through awareness. People weren't just angry at the act itself, but at the thought that it had likely happened countless times, unseen, unrecorded, disbelieved. 1 hour after the video was posted, Civil Watch reshared it with the caption, "Judged for In the next 2 hours, the hashtag was used over 10,000 times, mostly by NGOs, law students, and those who had experienced similar moments, but with no one to witness them. An older woman commented, "This happened to me in Georgia in 1982. No one filmed it, so they said I made it up." A former internal affairs officer wrote, "It's not that police don't know it's wrong. They just believe no one will ever see it. And then, the issue spilled beyond a single clip. Civil rights groups began reposting similar cases that had been overlooked. People of color stopped without cause. Women dragged from their cars without warrants. Children threatened in front of their families, all because they didn't look like they belonged. The hashtag "judged for existing" was no longer just a slogan. It had become an indictment of the system itself. Law enforcement agencies were exercising power based on instinct, not principle. And in the center of that storm, what haunted people wasn't the blow. It was the moment after, when the woman silently bent down to pick up a metal badge that had fallen from her coat pocket. There was no provocation, no reason for escalation, nothing that could justify those 3 strikes, except the feeling that she didn't look like someone who belonged. A young journalist wrote in the first analysis, "It's not the video that shocks us, it's the moral vacancy left behind after it ends." From a forgotten parking lot, a new national conversation began, not about job titles, not just about policing, but about the question, what do you have to look like to not be seen as a threat? Among the rising hashtags and chaotic commentary, one post stood apart. No tags, no headline, no viral image. Just a short paragraph uploaded that same afternoon to a Little Red personal blog. The author was Maya Sloan, a freelance reporter, a black woman in her 30s from another district. She wasn't famous, but she had worked long enough to know when to speak and when silence was enough. Her post was titled simply, "I was searched too." It wasn't an accusation, not a report, just a line that read like a diary. "I was once told to open my bag right at the entrance of a shopping mall, in front of dozens of people, but no one paused. No one asked, why her? Because I had no badge, nothing that made them hesitate. Beneath it was a description that felt suffocating in its simplicity. One hand dug through my purse like it was hunting for guilt. The other stayed close to his gun. I said nothing, just tried to breathe evenly. Not because I feared dying, but because I feared, if I reacted, no one would believe I hadn't done anything wrong. She didn't write much. She didn't have to. Shame doesn't need many words to take form. In just over 300 words, Maya never mentioned the viral clip, never named Amara. But every sentence, every image, struck a chord with those who had lived through that same moment, the one where your right to simply exist gets treated as a built-in offense. Late that afternoon, as messages and calls poured in, Amara remained in the special processing office, isolated under higher orders. No one questioned her, no one apologized, no one approached without permission. The system had begun to retreat, not from regret, but from fear of consequence. A trainee had left a browser open. On screen was Maya's blog. No video, no music, just black text on a white page, and a small photo at the bottom, a woman's hands holding an old purse, fingers still shaking. Amara didn't know Maya, but reading the last line, what hurt most wasn't what they did, it was that no one thought it mattered, made her eyes sting. Not from anger, but from a quiet understanding she had witnessed this not to fight, but to stand in place of those no one had ever seen. She closed the laptop, pressed her fingers to her temples. Everything fell silent. No phones, no typing, just her breath, caught between pain and gratitude. She was no longer alone, but she couldn't call it a victory. What victory exists when so many women had been searched, dragged, judged, and had nothing to shield them but silence? She turned to her desk and picked up her old leather notebook. No new words. Just the page from before. I exist, but not enough to be recognized where I serve. Today, one line more. I was seen for those who weren't. The next afternoon, the official site of the United States District Court for Region 3 posted a notice with a red seal. Regarding media reports on the courthouse incident, we confirm that the woman in the video is Judge Amara H. Cole, appointed on the 14th of last month under the U.S. Federal Court, Region 3. No emotion, no explanation, just public confirmation. Posted at 2:07 p.m., it was shared over 10,000 times in 1 hour. By then, the question had shifted from who is she to What happens now? At 4:30 p.m., the city police held a press conference. Reporters, cameras, and lights filled the room. The police chief appeared with legal and media staff behind him. The spokesperson began, "We respect all citizens. We acknowledge public concern. After initial review, we believe there was an unfortunate misunderstanding during an interaction during the courthouse." She continued, "The individual has been confirmed as a federal judge. We respect that. If protocol was breached, the matter will be handled internally." The moment everyone waited for, a clear apology, never came. Instead, "We regret any misunderstanding that may have occurred. The case is under review. Conclusions will follow internal procedure. We regret if misunderstanding," carefully chosen words to avoid admitting fault. Everyone in the room understood, but the system guarded itself. The cameras kept rolling, and the spokesperson managed optics. The truth couldn't be denied, so it was diluted. Outside, a group of law students held handwritten signs. No logos, no chants. One read, "An apology won't break the system, but refusing to apologize might." Amara didn't watch the press conference live. She didn't need to. She already knew the path they would take. What mattered wasn't the acknowledgement, it was how the system clung to power by refusing to say the simplest word. In that carefully crafted, "We regret any misunderstanding," she recognized something deeper than identity. When truth can no longer be hidden, it gets neutralized through indifference, not through action, but by saying less and doing even less. An emergency hearing was held the next morning at the city's Judicial Committee headquarters. Initially, the closed door between regulators and the police department became public once the video spread beyond the state. This was no longer an internal issue. It was a political aftershock, a fracture between authority and principle that could no longer be ignored. Amara was present. She wasn't invited to speak, she was asked only to provide context. She arrived alone, without legal counsel, without a prepared statement. She wore the same suit she had on 3 weeks earlier, the day she stood for her federal oath. It was the first time she stepped into the system as a judge. The chamber fell completely silent when she entered. No applause, no whispers, just the smallest shifts. Someone sat straighter, someone gripped a notebook tighter, someone lowered their eyes, as if everyone there understood that what they were about to hear mattered less than who was now sitting in front of them. Near the end of the hearing, an elderly councilman with silver hair and metal-rimmed glasses looked up from his file. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried clearly, "I have only one question. If she hadn't been a judge, then what?" The question landed in the room like cold iron, heavy, not because it was unclear, but because everyone understood it too well. It wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to expose. If she hadn't had a badge, if her name hadn't been in the system, if she'd been just another woman, those 3 strikes would have happened. But this time, no one would have cared. No one would call. No one would speak. That question ended all defense, even before words had stopped. No one could use misunderstanding to justify what would have continued if power hadn't been interrupted by position. The room fell silent. Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. She remained in the center row, not stepping forward, not bowing her head, not raising a badge. All she held was the small notebook, the one that had stayed with her through every hour at the station, through every moment the system ignored her because she didn't show up right. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, not in challenge, but something in her gaze made the silence heavier than any accusation. It didn't ask, "Why did you do this?" It simply said, "Now that you've seen, what will you do?" After the hearing ended, headlines appeared instantly. Federal judge's car smashed by police, but no apology given. Clips from the event were split and widely shared. The hashtag "judged for existing" resurfaced, now joined by new ones. No apology. Silent system. Amara Cole. Yet, just when public anger seemed most intense, people didn't demand that the officers be fired. They didn't call for the chief's resignation or prosecution of the system. What they asked for was simpler and harder for a system trained to speak in circles. An admission. A plain sentence. We were wrong, but it never came. Instead, an emergency meeting of the Internal Ethics Committee was held 3 days later. It took place on the 5th floor of the Regional Federal Police Headquarters, behind frosted glass, with attendance limited to those deemed need to know. No reporters, no live stream, no public statements. Citizens only learned of it through a short press release posted at 6:04 p.m. on the official site. The Ethics Committee has conducted a closed review of procedural handling regarding the incident on the 14th. Upon analysis, we conclude procedural review is required. No names were mentioned, no one was suspended, no apology was issued. Just that phrase, procedural review is required, long enough to sound responsible, vague enough to protect everyone, and careful enough not to create legal precedent. The public read it, then read it again. No one was surprised, but no one felt settled, because no one wanted someone to lose their job. They just wanted the system to admit that some things happened, things that should not have happened. The next morning, a resignation letter appeared on the desk of the police department's head of human resources. No email, no prior notice. The person resigning was a low-ranking officer, not well known, not seen in any video or report. He wasn't involved in the parking lot incident. He had no direct connection to Amara Cole, but he had been in the station that morning. He had walked past the waiting room where she sat alone beneath the banner reading Service, Justice, Community Protection. He had seen her badge fall from her pocket. And he had said nothing as a black woman sat in silence, surrounded by the weight of an entire system. The resignation letter contained a single sentence. I witnessed it, and I stayed silent. For the first time in the entire chain of events, people saw something the system itself hadn't been able to say, that some people, though never accused, still carry guilt. No one forced him to write that line. No one praised him for stepping down. But in the middle of a storm of words and statements, that quiet act carried the weight of a verdict no one could refute. Amara still said nothing. No social media posts, no legal demands. She simply kept showing up, on time, in place, doing the job, because she knew what the system fears most is not outrage, but a person it once tried to erase, still standing firm, forcing it to look at itself. One night, later in the week, a post appeared. No image, no hashtag, no bold design, just a white background, black text, and a plain opening line. I'm a second-year law student, and I've thought a lot about what happened to Judge Cole. The author, Elijah Tran, from Washington Law School, wasn't a known name. He didn't speak for any group, but what he wrote made thousands stop, not because it was angry, but because it was clear. Elijah didn't cite legal codes. He didn't argue technicalities. Instead, he asked, if Judge Cole had shown her badge from the very start, would anything have changed? Would they have stopped? Or would they have assumed it was fake because someone who looked like her couldn't possibly hold that badge? Then came the final line, the one that made the internet pause. She wasn't treated that way because they didn't know she was a judge. She was treated that way because they were sure she couldn't be. Just one sentence, but it was the clearest summary of everything that had happened, not because her identity was hidden, but because bias had already decided she didn't belong. It was that very certainty that made the system feel no need to check, no need to verify, no need to respect, and when the truth came out, they saw no reason to apologize. Because the fault wasn't in the procedure, it was in the mindset. The post spread like a cut across the conscience of a generation of law students. Young people who once believed the law was a shared foundation, now faced with the truth. That foundation doesn't hold equally for everyone. The next morning, Amara opened the news as she did every day. She didn't search for the post. It had been linked in a summary email by an intern at her office, someone unaware that by adding that link, they'd placed a mirror on the desk of a federal judge. She read it slowly, every word. No skipped lines, no fast-forwarding past the emotion. When she finished, she didn't share it. She didn't text back. She didn't reply. She simply closed her laptop and sat still. Her hand rested on the desk, beside the silver badge, silent, unargued evidence. Then she stood. She pulled the light gray hoodie from the coat rack, the same one she wore the day she was stopped, told to turn around, the day shards of glass fell on her shoulders, and no one thought it was wrong. That hoodie once read as a sign of suspicion, she now wore as living proof. What the system got wrong wasn't her behavior, but their expectation. That day, she arrived at the office on time. She took the stairs, nodded to the receptionist, carried her case files quietly, and in that silence, many saw her, and none looked away, because now they knew there had been a time when they were sure she could not be a judge. 3 days after the hearing, images of Amara Cole spread across every major media platform. No longer the blurred profile from the original clip, but edited portraits in black and white, with bold contrast and a caption under her chin. The judge who never bent. The first post in this style came from a well-known social issues magazine known for highlighting inspirational figures. They dedicated the entire cover of that month's special issue to her. No interview, no direct quotes, just a series of statements from activists, scholars, and politicians centered on one theme: the power of composure. Ironically, in their attempt to speak for her, they failed to say her name correctly. Right in the introduction, bold and prominent, Amara Cole, the federal judge whose silence shook the system. Amira, not Amara. One wrong letter. But it wasn't just a typo. It was like a sour note in music played too loudly, so loudly that people forgot to listen. She read the article that morning while preparing documents for her next hearing. Seeing the misspelled name, she didn't flinch. She understood. Once you become a symbol, the real person with the real name, the real voice, the real scars, can get swallowed by admiration itself. They didn't need to know her to be inspired. They only needed a model, one that didn't provoke, didn't complicate, didn't speak too much. A face that was strong, quiet, and polished, perfect to represent the message society wanted to see, not the layers she had lived. That afternoon, a streetwear brand announced on Instagram, Justice Drop, a limited collection inspired by the woman who woke America up. They didn't use her name. They didn't need to. What they needed was the gray hoodie. A piece of clothing once seen as suspicious is now repackaged as a symbol of quiet resistance. They recreated it almost exactly. The uneven shoulder seam, the faded hem, then stamped a new slogan on the back. Don't move, don't kneel, just exist. The post received over 120,000 likes in 6 hours. Comments flooded with fist emojis, hearts, and praise. Powerful, iconic, I want this. No one asked if she agreed. No one knew what she thought. And in a world driven by speed, her silence was taken as consent. But that evening, at home, Amara hung the original hoodie back on its hook. Just as always, the fabric is still slightly coarse from glass dust that hadn't fully washed out. She stared at it for a while, not out of nostalgia, but because the truth was simple. It wasn't a justice drop. It wasn't a symbol. It was the hoodie she wore when she was insulted, ordered, hit, and disbelieved as a judge. And now it was replicated, sold for $120 a piece to people who had never been stopped by the words, "Turn around." She said nothing, as always. But for the first time, she wrote a line in her notebook, not to publish, just to remind herself. When they turn you into a symbol, remember to keep your name before they place another one on top. The morning in the office began like any other, except for one thing. Today, she chose to respond, not to the press, not to the public, to herself. She sat down and answered every invitation stacked on her desk, big names, big shows, proposals to share her story with fairness and inspiration. But she didn't need to retell it. They had already seen. And once the truth is clear, it doesn't need to be reframed from multiple angles. She replied briefly, but firmly. No bitterness, no avoidance, just a calm refusal, as if stepping away from a conversation that never truly belonged to her. She wasn't a symbol for others to create. She was the one who stood at the moment the system hoped no one would. The office remained quiet. Outside, the photocopier hummed and heels echoed softly down the hallway. No one knocked. No one interrupted. Only one thing had changed. A small bulletin board in the corner. A new staff member paused when they noticed it. Once used for meeting schedules and internal notes, It was now filled with letters, torn pages, and handwritten messages from people who had never met her. No one had asked to post them, but each note had found its place. One high school student shared how their friend was pulled from the library for forgetting an ID. No one asked her name before giving orders. A law student admitted to staying silent after witnessing an unjust search at a train station, writing, "I didn't know if I had the voice to speak up." At the center of the board, one printed line stood alone, unsigned. It wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. "I don't want to be a judge, but now I want to stand still, the way you once did." Amara stood at the board for a long moment, not out of emotion, but because she understood. Amid the noise, someone had heard the silence and chosen to hold on to it. She didn't respond. She didn't reach out to anyone. But the next morning, during a session with the new intern group, she changed one small thing, not the agenda, not her tone, just her gaze. She paused longer when a young woman raised her hand and asked, "Has justice ever stayed quiet because it knew speaking up would get it dismissed?" She didn't answer right away, but this time she didn't look away. She spoke slowly, clearly. "Speaking up isn't always the answer, but if someone once stood still at the right moment, sometimes the next person finds the courage not to turn away." She didn't mention the incident. She didn't have to. Everyone knew what she meant. No name, no title, just a presence steady enough not to require explanation. In a world where everyone wants to tell, to frame, to inspire, choosing not to say more became the very thing that made others ask themselves, "What would I do when it's my turn?" Amara left the office late in the afternoon, carrying only a case file and the same worn badge. But in the eyes of the young people who quietly stood to greet her, something had changed. They no longer saw just a judge. They saw someone who had once not been believed to be one, and who still chose to stand tall. Some wounds don't bleed, yet they pass through generations. Quietly, steadily, like a collective memory no one dares to name. People assume they've healed. In truth, they've only been buried beneath enough silence that no one bothers to touch them anymore. That morning, just after finishing a meeting with the internal legal research team, Amara received a small package. No sender's name, no message. Just a postmark from a southern state once central to the civil rights movement 6 decades earlier. She opened it with mild curiosity, the kind that comes with a workday full of paperwork. Inside was a thin notebook, fabric-bound, its brown cover worn. No title, no dates, but on the first page, in dark blue ink, shaky but sharp, were the words, "The day I was forced to leave the park because of my skin color." Amara sat down and flipped through each page. The entries were brief, no embellishments, just a series of moments. Hot water not served. A park bench, reserved for someone else. A dismissive glance from a passerby. Nothing that bled, but enough to make someone feel unwelcome in a place meant for everyone. The writer was a woman. She didn't sign her name, but through the tone, the tilt of the handwriting fading near the end, Amara knew this wasn't someone telling a story to others. It was someone writing to remember. For herself. The final page held a single line, written in a different hand, added years later, "I never thought I'd live long enough to see someone like you sit in that seat." Amara closed the notebook. Her hand rested on the cover, not out of emotion, but as if touching a piece of living history. One never recorded in textbooks, never printed in news, never honored in stone, but it had arrived just when she needed to know. She was not the first to be pushed aside, and she could not be the last to only sit and watch. The next day, an anonymous email arrived. It read, "I used to be a cop. I've seen it too. I looked away, but this time, I chose to face it." Amara read the message and sat still for a long while. She didn't know who had written it. She couldn't tell if it came from someone who had once worked at the police department that held her that day. But it didn't matter. For her, the confession didn't need a name, only presence. In her years on the bench, Amara had heard hundreds of testimonies. She could tell when someone spoke to avoid guilt, and when they spoke to free themselves. Those 4 lines weren't an excuse. They were the sign of someone who had lived with silence long enough to know it could rot a system from within. Amara didn't reply, but that night she brought the old notebook home. She placed it on the shelf next to the rulings she'd written. It wasn't an official record. It held no legal weight, but it was part of a picture that generations pushed aside had quietly been painted over for half a century. And now, in a new century and in America still struggling to name what it never fully acknowledged, a woman forced out of a park in 1963, a former officer who once stayed silent, and a judge in a hoodie at a parking lot had somehow ended up standing in a row, never having met, but facing the same direction. The event poster was printed on ash-gray paper. No faces, no dramatic quotes. Just one line in the center, Voice/Less, a forum on police violence and forgotten memory. The event was hosted by a group of senior students from a modest university's sociology and public law department. They didn't send Amara an invitation. They didn't ask permission to use her name. They didn't plan to turn the forum into a tribute. They created it to read. Not to reread what the press had written, but to speak aloud what had never made it onto paper. On stage were low wooden chairs, no speaker table, no banners. Each person brought one page, sometimes an old file copy, sometimes a handwritten letter, just a few words scribbled from memory. One spoke of their father, searching at a subway station just for placing his hand inside his coat. Another read a letter from their mother. "Do you know, there were times I didn't tell you I got pulled over because I feared you'd ask why." One person didn't speak at all. They played a short recording of their quiet sobs, age 8, after being pushed out of a store for no reason. No one said Amara's name, because everyone knew they stood in a room that would not have existed had one person not stood still when no one else believed it mattered. Amara sat at the back. She hadn't registered. No one knew she would come. But when she saw the event posted on a student's site, she decided to go, not to hear anything specific, but to see, when no one calls her name, does anyone still hold the spirit of what she once did? She sat in the back row. No one noticed. No one approached. Dressed, holding a slim, unmarked book, she blended in. When the fourth speaker stepped up, a brown-skinned student with a raspy voice, and read from a 1994 report about a teen beaten for staring too long at an officer, Amara felt a chill run through her. She raised the book to cover part of her face, not to hide, just to steady herself. Tears blurred one eye. Quiet, but real. What she heard wasn't data, it wasn't an analysis, it was memory, the kind too often dismissed as too small to matter. In that moment, she didn't feel alone. She didn't need to speak. Others were saying what she no longer had to say, through their pain. She closed the book, sat upright, let the tear fall without wiping it. It wasn't weakness. It was space, opened for voices once cut off too soon. Outside, people still debated if she should represent a movement, but inside that quiet hall, she knew power isn't always in being heard. Sometimes it's when others speak, because silence is no longer an option. The morning on the 8th floor moved as usual. Outside the window, the early season breeze stirred the small tree below the Federal Building. Down the hall, footsteps echoed steadily across the stone floor. The rhythm of administrative life felt familiar, but something about today's quiet was different, a kind of silence that came not from emptiness, but from anticipation. Amara was reviewing notes for an internal hearing when a knock came, soft, measured, not the knock of someone needing a signature, but more like a person borrowing a few seconds of air, not a conversation. She looked up. The door eased open. A young face appeared, thin, eyes slightly shadowed, holding a folder, looking like someone who had just left the library at midnight. He didn't step in. He stood at the threshold and asked, in a voice just low enough not to disturb the hallway, "May I sit here for a few minutes?" She nodded. No questions. She didn't ask what department he was from or which unit had sent him. Some moments don't need introductions. His hesitation was reason enough. He stepped in and sat down on the chair a short distance from her desk. He didn't ask anything, didn't explain. The folder stayed untouched at his side. Instead, his eyes fixed on an old newspaper framed on the shelf, showing the first front-page photo of the shattered car window, a woman's hand clutching a box. hair tousled by wind. He stared at the image for a long time, occasionally blinking but never looking away, as if rereading something that couldn't be found in the printed lines. Amara returned to her work, but glanced over now and then. He didn't look visibly emotional. He didn't appear to be reflecting. He was simply there. Present, and that presence in a room long accustomed to reports, schedules, and rubber stamps made everything feel a few degrees quieter. After 10 minutes, he stood up. He didn't say goodbye, didn't apologize for the interruption. He just gave a small nod, less to her than to the space, and walked out, leaving behind the faint sense of a breeze that wasn't cold, but enough to make someone pause their breath. Amara stayed still for a while. Her eyes remained on the screen, but her mind lingered on the empty chair. Not because of anything he said, but because of what he hadn't. Something tightly held back, as if speaking it might break what he was still trying to protect. It wasn't admiration, it wasn't sympathy, and it wasn't curiosity. It was the gaze of someone who understood. Some moments are meant to be lived slowly, not to find answers, but to keep hold of the fragile sense that justice might still exist in quiet places. Amara returned to her notes, but when her fingers touched the keyboard, they paused. She didn't type, didn't edit, because she knew something had just happened, something that wouldn't appear in any official report, but deserved to be kept in memory. A young person had entered the room simply to sit. No request, no advice sought, but enough to show that change doesn't always begin with action. Sometimes it starts by not turning away from a moment that needs to be seen. The next day, he returned. No appointment, no knock. When Amara walked in, he was already there, chair upright, back resting lightly, eyes on the desk still faintly dusted from last night's open window. She set down her bag, opened her laptop. No words. He didn't speak either, but something had shifted. He brought a damp cloth, wiped the desk, the chair's edge, the windowsill, the doorknob. Each motion was slow, careful, not performative. No one asked, no one watched. But in that silence, every gesture felt less like service, more like a quiet order to the world she tried to keep balanced each day. Amara didn't stop him. She let him continue, as if it were a natural part of the morning. But on the third day, when the light outside was just bright enough to reflect the image of the car across the courtyard onto her office glass, she turned and spoke softly, not to startle him, but firmly enough not to be mistaken as polite. Many people, she said, won't get another chance to make right what they once ignored. He paused, didn't turn, just tilted his head slightly to hear. She went on, this time offering a rare kind of instruction, never printed in law books. But you still can. He nodded. No questions. No, thank you, like people usually say when comforted. He understood it wasn't encouragement. It was a warning. That silence isn't always innocent. And sometimes the only thing separating a generation from repeating the same mistakes is one person realizing they still have time to choose differently. From that day on, Amara's mornings began with small sounds, the cloth gliding across her desk, the quiet scrape of a chair being straightened, the soft wind slipping through the window just before she entered. 15 minutes a day, no explanations, no glances asking for acknowledgement. He never tried to be helpful, never asked for advice, never touched what wasn't his, but something about his presence made the office no longer just a judge's workspace. It became a place where what had been overlooked was quietly gathered, cleaned, and returned to where it belonged. That consistency, with no schedule, no promises, became the clearest expression of something Amara had feared was rare, a sense of responsibility that came unassigned, unsupervised, and self-chosen. Others might see it as trivial, but she knew, in a world busy proving itself right, it takes a rare kind of courage for someone young to step back, not to lead, but to help what's right stay in place. Amara said nothing more in the days that followed. She simply left one chair by the window untouched, no files stacked on it, no meetings booked over the usual time he arrived. A quiet way of saying, your presence, though unnamed, is recognized as part of this room. And so each day began not with bells nor agendas, but with a small act of care by someone who once stayed silent and now had chosen to remain. When the official report on the incident was released, there were no alarms, no public press conference, just a PDF quietly uploaded to the police department's internal website, buried between routine bulletins on shift changes and administrative policy updates. If no one noticed, it would have faded like hundreds of documents before it, leaving behind only a filing number. But people noticed. From the very first line, the report framed the event with a phrase used far too often: a case of mistaken identity. No footnotes, no context, no open questions. The summary covered only 3 paragraphs. It omitted the sound of shattering glass, the dented car door, the presence of the person who recorded the video, and any mention of the federal badge held clearly in the woman's hand the entire time. More importantly, the 2 names once listed in the initial detention memo had vanished. They were replaced with a generic label: patrol officers from the Rapid Response Unit. No photos, no ID numbers, no signatures. Some called it a cover-up, but to those familiar with administrative language, it was something more deliberate, written just enough to appear transparent, yet vague enough to avoid assigning personal accountability. At the same time, in a small office belonging to a lesser-known law firm, a young attorney sat reading the file with unusual calm. She had once worked in a prosecutor's office, knew how language was chosen, and had edited hundreds of reports to avoid disrupting institutional structure. But this time, she chose not to remain on the sideline. 3 days after the file was posted, she submitted a petition to the federal court. It was not a complaint, nor an attack. It read like a moral appeal, to preserve the event in the system, not as a mishap, but as a lesson. The final sentence on the last page read, "I do not ask that they be fired. I ask that they be remembered for what they did." Amara read that petition on a late afternoon. She didn't know the author, but she understood exactly what was being asked. Not revenge, not erasure, just an assertion that some mistakes should not be forgotten simply because they caused no death or failed to trend at the top of the news. The greatest danger of a system with no major wrongdoing lies in its ability to quietly erase whatever doesn't fit its image. When collective memory is rewritten with language sanitized for safety, truth doesn't disappear, it just loses its power to warn. The petition didn't include new evidence, no witnesses, and that made it clearer than any stamped report. It was a voice from a young person, not loud, but firm enough to make the system stop and read. In a world that's grown used to forgetting what's uncomfortable, having someone remind us that the incident still happened is a form of justice in itself. The hearing took place on a quiet Monday morning, inside room B13 at the Regional Federal Courthouse. No crowds, no press allowed. Attendees had official roles: representatives from regulatory bodies, local judiciary, legal counsel from the police department, a few independent observers, and junior lawyers permitted to observe for training purposes. No one expected anything significant. The petition, though widely shared online, wasn't binding. It couldn't compel change or force the redacted names to reappear. The plan was routine: some light questioning, vague promises to review procedures, then adjournment. Forgotten. But as the hearing entered its 3rd segment, when participants could speak voluntarily, the door at the back opened. No one turned immediately, but a single set of footsteps echoed through the silence. Steady, unhurried. No briefcase, no introduction. Amara Cole. Some recognized her instantly. Others needed a moment to realize that the woman walking toward the presiding bench was the very person this hearing revolved around, yet whose name wasn't listed to speak, nor confirmed to attend. She didn't wait to be acknowledged. From her pocket, she pulled a thin, worn silver badge and placed it on the table. Judicial ID. In that moment, it didn't appear as a symbol of power, but a quiet reminder that someone previously omitted from the system was now standing here, in full view, with the identity that this place once delayed recognizing. And stay long. A nod, a step back, then she turned and left, less than a minute. But no one resumed speaking right away. The pause rippled through every row, as if the room had been reset by a question no one wanted to answer. How complete is a system that requires someone like her to show up, in person, just to prove she exists. The hearing went on, but something had shifted. Voices stumbled. Assurances to review procedure no longer flowed with practiced ease. No one had been charged. Yet everyone knew the woman who said nothing had left behind something no transcript could record. Truth doesn't live in policy. It lives in action, and sometimes action needs no voice. The federal building was quiet by late afternoon. Warm yellow lights settled softly over the hallways, and the end-of-day footsteps sounded more distant, more hollow than usual. Amara was closing the last folder on her desk, preparing to leave the office, when a knock came at the door. It wasn't urgent nor tense, but steady enough not to be mistaken for someone simply passing by. She looked up. Standing in the doorway was a middle-aged man, his police uniform buttoned to the collar, a silver badge on his lapel. A senior officer. She had never worked with him directly, but had seen his name on the internal complaint coordination roster. His expression carried no authority, only the exhaustion of someone who had gone far beyond what was necessary to keep something quiet for too long. He didn't greet her. He didn't make small talk. He just stepped in, reached into his coat, and placed a folder bound in cardboard gently onto her desk, moving with the kind of care that felt like he didn't want to disturb the stillness of the room. Amara looked down. There was no label on the cover. The pages inside were standard administrative printouts, pale black ink, proper punctuation, formal phrasing. But the contents were unlike anything she had received through official channels. They were statements, not one, many. A civilian described standing nearby the day the car was smashed. Another claimed to have seen one of the officers shouting from the start, even though the woman had done nothing but hold a box. One note, handwritten and shaky, recalled a child crying at the sound of breaking glass. There was even a copy of a complaint from a courthouse staffer, submitted but never acknowledged. None of it had ever made it into any report. These were pieces deliberately left out of the official record, not because they lacked legal weight, but because no one inside the system wanted them to exist. She didn't ask how he had them. She didn't ask why now. But the look in his eyes, as he waited in silence, said everything his mouth didn't. The silence hadn't come from ignorance. It had come from a belief that staying quiet was once more important than speaking up. Amara took the stack of papers, flipped through the first few pages, then looked up. He was still standing there, arms hanging loosely, gaze steady like a soldier who had surrendered his weapon, not out of defeat, but because he knew the war needed to end from within. Not on the front lines. She didn't thank him. There was no gratitude between them, no favors exchanged, only a brief moment in which someone chose to step out of safety and lay the first stone in dismantling what he once helped uphold, the silence. He turned without another word, leaving the door slightly ajar. The room was quiet again, save for the wind slipping gently through the window frame. Amara looked back at the documents, fully aware this wasn't evidence for prosecution, nor was it enough to reverse any conclusions that had already been sealed. But to her, the papers carried a different kind of weight. They proved that someone on the other side of the system had been watching, had remembered, and, most importantly, had chosen not to look away when the moment truly arrived. Silence is a choice, but like any choice, no one can hold it forever if their conscience is still working. Before leaving the office, the man paused at the doorway. He didn't turn around, only tilted his head slightly so his voice didn't have to rise to be heard. "I used to think staying silent meant protecting the institution," he said. Not loudly, not firmly, but with something in his tone that dropped like a hairline crack finally being named. "Now I know it's how it rots from the inside." He didn't wait for a response. He walked away, leaving behind a gap, not large in space, but wide enough for anyone standing there to feel the air slip in from somewhere other than the window. Amara remained seated. The folder in front of her hadn't been reopened, but the words inside still echoed in the silence behind her. She didn't know exactly who he was in the intricate layers of the department's internal structure, nor how long he had stayed quiet. But that one sentence, from someone who once believed in stability at all costs, held a gravity no hearing or public address could ever match. In the end, it wasn't a confession or an apology, it was simply an act of recognition, the kind that doesn't rewrite what happened, but refuses to let it be erased. And sometimes, that alone is enough to shift what a system dares to forget. The next morning, in the Office of Internal Affairs, the personnel director found a folder on the desk. No envelope, no note, just a clipped stack of papers. On top was a witness statement, describing the color of an officer's jacket and the tone used when the woman was ordered to open her trunk without cause. What stood out wasn't the content, but the faint fingerprint at the bottom corner of the last page. No name, no signature, just a quiet signal of someone choosing to place responsibility where it belonged. The director didn't speak. He knew this had no legal weight without confirmation, but dismissing it would mean letting the system erase what remained. The fingerprint needed no scan to know whose it was. The question wasn't who sent it, but why it had taken so long, and that delay turned the file into a statement, a record of what the system once believed could be hidden by hierarchy. Mara wasn't there. She didn't need to be. From the man who left her office to the folder placed exactly where it mattered, each step came without names but carried consequences, and those consequences weren't scandal or punishment, but quiet recognition that silence could no longer be seen as safety. She went on with her day. Everything looked the same, but people's eyes shifted slightly when they entered her office. Not with awe, not with pity, but with a quiet respect for someone who didn't look away, even when no one told her to stay. Sometimes, that's enough to start again, with a little more truth. One late afternoon, Amara received a message from a group of final-year constitutional law students at a public university. They said they had followed the case closely, read all the hearing transcripts and petitions, and quoted her in class discussions. They invited her to an open session. No attendance sheet, no tests, just a room where students could ask questions without expecting answers. "We want to know how not to become part of that silence," the letter ended. She didn't go. Not because she didn't want to speak, but because she knew that if she entered the room, she would become the focus, not the conversation. Her presence might turn sincere reflection into hero worship, and what the students needed most was space to think freely, not a symbol to follow. Instead, she sent back a folded note with one line: "The law will not protect you if the one holding it doesn't stand with you." No name, no explanation. But the message was clear. It wasn't from a textbook. It came from someone who had lived through the law being present, yet powerless. The professor read the note aloud, then said nothing. He placed it on the desk and stepped back. The students didn't clap, they didn't speak, but something shifted. Pens were set down, backs straightened. In silence, they understood what no lecture had explained. After class, one student wrote the quote at the top of her notes, another copied it on the board, and by the next session, questions poured in, not to challenge what happened, but to ask, how can a system that follows the law still fail the people it's supposed to serve? Amara didn't know any of this was happening. She didn't need to. Her goal had never been to teach. She only wanted to place one question back where it belonged, at the center of a legal system too afraid to ask it. If the system is built to protect, who protects the system from those who act in its name? And if even one generation begins to ask that question, even in a quiet classroom on an ordinary afternoon, then everything she had done, silently or not, would not have been in vain. At the end of that class, in the final course feedback, a student left a single sentence at the bottom of the page. No comments on the curriculum. No evaluation of teaching method. Just a line, slanted and in darker ink, as if added last, when nothing else felt necessary. "You didn't teach us, but you made us want to learn." The staff member, reviewing the feedback, read it late in the evening, paused, and folded the page gently, setting it aside, not for review, but for remembering. A copy of that sentence was later pinned to the law school library bulletin board. No student name, no course number, No date, just a sentence, quiet among exam notices and meeting reminders, but one that drew the eye of those who had been in that open session. Some stopped to read without speaking. Some nodded. Others took a photo, not to post, but to keep, marking a moment when they felt they'd touched something true. Later, a message appeared in the class group chat, not from faculty, not from a class rep, just a suggestion. This weekend, if anyone's free, let's go by where she works. Not to meet her, not for autographs, just to stand by that old car, the one where it all began. Saturday afternoon brought a sky heavy with clouds, like it might rain, but not enough to cancel plans. About 20 students showed up. They didn't speak much. Some brought cameras, some held phones. Each stood in their spot, but no one crowded forward. They formed a quiet, even line behind the silver car parked at the far corner of the small lot outside the federal office. The car hadn't been restored. No ribbons, no plaque. The crack across the windshield was still there, spreading like a vein that would never heal. The left mirror is still slightly misaligned. The silver paint had faded to gray in places where the sun had burned it too long. But they hadn't come to see a vehicle. They came to witness the remnants of a story retold so often that people forgot it began with things real and small. No one smiled for the camera. No one struck a pose or tried to make the moment more lively than it needed to be. But everyone stood straight. No one had to remind them. No one gave directions. It was something instinctual. When you stand where justice was once denied, your presence becomes its clearest response. Amara didn't come out. She knew they were there. The window on the 8th floor gave her just enough view to see the quiet line gathered around the old car. She stood behind the curtain, unmoving, taking no photos. She simply watched, then returned to her desk, where an unfinished ruling still waited for her final edits. And in that ordinariness, she understood, no lecture is needed to change a classroom. Sometimes it begins with a sentence, not found in any textbook, and a car left unrepaired, because some cracks, once exposed, are meant to remain visible, as a reminder that something once needed to be faced head-on. The interview was not planned. It happened on the sidelines of a judicial reform symposium, where Amara had only intended to attend as an observer, not to speak. A reporter from a young political commentary outlet with little public recognition approached her in the hallway outside the conference room. He didn't rush, didn't interrupt, only stepped forward gently and asked, in a tone polite enough not to feel intrusive, "Ma'am, if there hadn't been a camera that day, would you have spoken up?" The question wasn't loud, but it landed squarely in the pause between two panel sessions, drawing a few unintended glances their way. Amara stopped. She held his gaze, exhaled slowly, then answered without taking long to think. "No, but not because I was afraid, because I know sometimes silence is the only way to survive." The reporter nodded, thanked her, and stepped back, as if knowing he had received an answer that needed no follow-up. It wasn't a line meant to assert righteousness or construct a doctrine, but it held the full weight of experience that outsiders too often misread. Her words didn't reject courage, nor did they glorify resistance. They spoke of reality, that sometimes the right thing to do isn't to speak, but to remain whole, to still be standing when the noise passes. Amara wasn't trying to teach anyone with that line. She simply voiced what all those who've been dismissed by the system understand. Survival, at times, is the first form of personal justice. 2 days later, a major news outlet ran the quote, but not all of it. The headline in bold read, "Judge Amara Cole admits, I stayed silent out of fear." There was no follow-up line. No context, no mention of where or how the conversation had taken place, nor any clarification of why the rest of the sentence was left out. Readers responded in every way imaginable. Some felt empathy, saying it was a necessary truth. Others criticized her for undercutting her role as a symbol. Some turned the quote into memes, spreading it online as another example of a public figure contradicting the narrative they were assigned. Amara didn't issue a correction. She understood clearly that when a system is used to extract fragmented quotes to shape a story as it sees fit, saying more only pushes what needs to be heard further from the center of attention. She didn't blame the reporter who asked, nor the editor who cut, but the next morning at work, when she saw the article printed out and placed on her desk by an intern, she simply folded it and placed it in her drawer, not to hide it, but to remind herself that what she once said no longer belonged to her. That answer had left her lips, slipped out of context and beyond her control, but the reason she gave it remained clear. She never said she wasn't afraid. She said fear wasn't the reason for silence. Sometimes staying quiet is the only way to survive in a space where reason has no room. What mattered wasn't that she stayed silent that day, but that afterward she was still standing, able to walk into a hearing, place her badge on the table, and not look away when truth needed a witness. 3 days after the article stirred controversy, a different piece appeared on an independent blog. No ads, no flashy title, no press team, but within 24 hours it was shared 10 times more than the original. Not for drama, but because its opening line got it right. I watched the full exchange between her and the reporter, and here's the full quote. "No, but not because I was afraid, because I know sometimes silence is the only way to survive." No one knew the author, just 2 initials, no photo, no other posts. But the tone was calm and firm. No blame, no outrage, just a correction. In closing, the writer said, "If truth can be distorted just by cutting a sentence in half, then maybe lies aren't even needed. Convenience alone can undo everything." People began sharing the full quote, not in protest but to set the record straight. The next morning, Amara found a hand-delivered letter in her office inbox. No postmark, no name. She opened it while prepping for a meeting, expecting a routine memo, but she paused. Someone had cared enough to say, "The whole truth matters." Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting slightly slanted, black ink, clean, with no signs of haste. It wasn't long, wasn't poetic. Just a quiet confession, light as air but heavy as stone. "I don't know you, but for the first time, I feel I owe a stranger the truth." Mara read it over and over, not because she didn't understand it, but because she wasn't sure what part of it made her chest tighten. There was no name, no reference to any article, no links or images attached, but she knew it was the person who had written the correction. No confirmation was needed. Only someone who had seen it firsthand, heard it clearly, and carried the weight of it deeply could write something that simple, that honest. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because the truth, when written down, isn't meant to be answered. It just needs to be acknowledged. That afternoon, she left the office earlier than usual. Not to avoid anyone, not for rest. She just wanted to feel the wind. Not filtered through glass, not muffled by insulation, not framed by paperwork. The breeze carried the scent of grass and street dust, rough but real. And standing in the quiet courtyard behind the federal building, she thought of the most paradoxical thing she'd witnessed. In a system where a judge's voice could be trimmed and distorted, it was an unknown civilian, no title, no power, who had done what an entire newsroom would not. They put the words back where they belonged. Amara looked up, not searching for anything, just to remind herself that sometimes justice doesn't arrive from official channels. It comes from a stranger who decides they can't stay silent anymore. And sometimes that is enough. Early Monday morning, the 8th floor office was quieter than usual. No internal meetings scheduled, no urgent emails. No one waiting outside with thick folders. Only the soft light of early sun filtered through the glass window, touching the desk like a thin layer of golden dust. Amara entered, as she did every day, carrying nothing but a small bag of documents and her familiar signing pen. She shut the door, removed her watch, and gently placed one object in the center of the desk, the judicial badge. Its corner was worn, the metal surface scratched, the engraved letters no longer as sharp, but it was the same badge that had sat in her pocket the day she was stopped, had fallen onto cold pavement while one man raised a baton and another dared not breathe as he filmed. She didn't place the badge on a pedestal. She left it flat on the wooden surface next to another object delivered that morning, a photo frame, hand-size, dark wood trim, no design, no symbols. But inside was not a family portrait or a certificate, just a piece of glass, old, uneven, slightly sharp at the edge, with a crack running from the bottom left to the middle, no caption, no note of origin, but Amara knew exactly where it came from. It was a shard from her car's windshield, the one that shattered under a baton's blow, falling onto her shoulder as a child nearby gasped in shock. When the car was towed for inspection after the incident, the mechanic was going to discard the remaining broken glass. She'd asked to keep a piece, not as evidence, not from sentiment, but to remember what had happened. Now, it sat in the frame, uncleaned, unpolished, carefully mounted like something that shouldn't be thrown away, even if it no longer served a function. The first person to enter her office that day was a coordinator. He paused at the sight, didn't ask, didn't look surprised. His eyes moved across the framed glass, then the badge, then rested on her face, waiting for a kind of explanation that might help settle the quiet stir in his chest. She didn't explain. She just said softly, slowly, "Some things don't have to be whole to still hold value." He nodded, asked nothing more, because he understood. He understood that what had once broken, once cracked, once stopped being pristine, can sometimes carry more weight than any polished plaque on a wall, not because it represents victory, but because it marks a moment when everything nearly vanished, and its continued existence is proof that what is right can still stand, even if not intact. Throughout that morning, everyone who entered the office saw the framed shard of glass. Some paused a little longer, others merely glanced at it. No one asked. But each left with a slightly different expression, as if something long buried beneath the weight of daily routine had been stirred awake by an object no longer functional. Not everything left behind after damage needs to be replaced. Some things, when left untouched, become a stronger reminder than any lesson printed on paper. Amara continued her work as usual. She didn't change how she wrote memos or how she read rulings in court, but in the space where she sat, two small objects lay side by side, one representing formal authority, the other the fragility that had once been dismissed. Together they told a story that needed no words. From then on, no statue was erected, no magazine cover bore her face, yet the small office retained its function, and those who walked through it knew something had once shattered there. Near noon, a young staffer from the admin team came in to drop off the updated weekly schedule. He didn't speak much normally, but today, as he set the page down, his eyes rested a moment on the small glass frame beside the silver badge. He looked at it more closely, then quietly asked, "Why didn't you replace the glass?" It wasn't judgment, just honest curiosity. The kind someone asks when they see a crack left exposed and don't understand why it wasn't made new. Amara didn't look up immediately. She was reviewing a section of a document that needed approval, but when she did lift her head, her voice was calm, clear, neither elaborate nor cold. "Because some things are meant to be seen, not covered." He nodded slightly, said nothing else. He placed the folder down, gave a small nod, and left, his steps slower than usual. The door closed softly behind him, but her answer lingered in the room long enough to soften the familiar quiet. That afternoon, something in the office felt different. People who rarely visited came by. A staffer from downstairs dropped in by chance. A legal department colleague delivered a file in person. Someone from external affairs came looking for an old document. They didn't stay long. No one mentioned the framed glass, but each glance paused on it, just for a moment. No one asked questions. No one took photos. No one praised it. But when they left, their expressions had changed, as if they'd passed through a space where something unspoken was understood. Some returned to their desks and reopened old files. Others paused longer than usual in front of blank screens, not because they were stuck, but because something quiet had shifted their rhythm. Amara didn't look up as they came and went. She didn't hide the badge or the glass. She kept working, but she knew every person who left carried a part of what they saw, not to share it, just to keep it. That day, her quiet office became a space of quiet memory with no need for words. No one lingered too long, no one cried, but the stillness itself made the space feel heavier, not with sadness, but with something more honest. They didn't come for the spectacle, they came to feel, and left when they'd felt enough. When the day ended and the room emptied, Amara stayed behind. She didn't look at the badge or the glass. She just closed her eyes, breathed evenly, and knew today she didn't need to speak. Something else had spoken for her. The Civic Law Day event was held at a public high school on the east side of the city. There were no major sponsors, no celebrity guests, just an initiative by a group of 11th grade students in the Social Studies Club. They designed posters themselves, wrote the scripts, built booths with cardboard models of mock trials, multiple choice quizzes on civil rights, and role-playing games to better understand how laws operate in everyday life. In the invitation sent to local legal institutions, they didn't name any specific guests. They simply wrote, "We hope to welcome those who once chose to stand for what was right, even when no one asked them to." That invitation passed through several office layers before unexpectedly landing in Amara's hands during a light Monday morning briefing. She didn't confirm attendance, didn't send a reply, but that morning, at the exact hour of the opening ceremony, she was there. No introduction, no stepping onto the stage, no request for a reserved seat. She sat in the last row, near the exit, wearing a dark shirt, no name badge, and carrying nothing but a worn notebook. She sat still, watching everything unfold with an expression that judged nothing and interrupted even less. On stage, a group of students performed a skit about the right to remain silent during questioning. Another student, acting as the host, asked the crowd whether justice still existed if the law was distorted by those who enforce it. A younger student softly responded, "Depends on who's watching at that moment." The comment made the room pause slightly, but no one disputed it. No one recognized her right away. Not until a teacher walking past the back row glanced at a familiar face did someone's expression shift. He didn't say her name, didn't alert anyone, just hesitated for half a second, then kept walking as if acknowledging that today her quiet presence meant more than any speech. Amara didn't stay for the whole event. After about an hour, she stood up. No one stopped her. No one escorted her out. But a few students looked after her, sensing something unspoken. Not because they'd seen her in the news, but because of how she moved. Her gaze, the carefulness of each step, as though she didn't want to leave a sound behind. One student with a camera managed to capture a photo just as Amara stepped through the doorway. Her face wasn't visible. Only her backlit silhouette in the hallway light led out to the schoolyard. But later, it was the photo printed in the club's end-of-year yearbook, with a simple caption, "Someone came, not to be seen, but so we could learn to look closer." Mara didn't know about the photo. She didn't need to. Just being there, quietly, was enough to affirm that what she had chosen to hold on to, from a cracked window to an unfinished sentence, had started to reach others. She didn't come to inspire, only to observe. But sometimes, choosing the back row without stepping forward is the clearest way to leave space for others to rise. That day, no awards were given. No one was praised. But to students still learning the line between theory and reality, one thing became clear. Justice isn't a destination, it's a way of walking. And when someone who's already walked that path quietly returns and sits among those still finding their footing, it means what's right, when rooted deeply, will grow. After she left, the program continued. A student stood on stage and, without notes or fanfare, said, "Justice isn't in the courtroom. It's in how we react when someone's treated unfairly." No applause followed. It wasn't a slogan, it was a truth that made people stop, not because it was new, but because it was finally said right. The teacher nearby didn't add anything, he just nodded, as if to say, some truths don't need to be taught, only heard. Outside, Amara walked past student-painted murals on old brick walls, images about race, violence, and access to education. Not all were perfect, but each tried to ask old questions in a new way. She didn't look back. But for those who saw her walk out, they would later say something about that presence, that silence, that small gesture of simply showing up, without titles or speeches, taught them more than any law book ever could. She stopped by the school's mailbox. No one was around. The air was still, save for leaves rustling and distant footsteps from the court. She took out a folded note. On it, a single, handwritten line. "I read the old map for too long. Thank you for drawing a new one." She slipped it inside, closed the box, and left. There was no signature, but she knew the message would be understood, not just as thanks, but as a quiet admission from someone who once believed the path was fixed, only to realize they'd need to learn how to navigate again. The old system never mapped silence, never marked those outside view, never showed a way out for anyone misread by position alone. That day, the students had begun redrawing the map, not with perfect lines or official colors, but with instinct and a sense of fairness not yet dulled by rules. And that was what Amara once feared she'd lost. She didn't look back walking out. She didn't need to. No footprint left, just a message in the right place. And if the students stayed true to their course, that little note would live on, not in the margins, but at the center of the map. The reminder that justice isn't waiting at the end, but shaped by each step we choose. And sometimes, one sentence left behind is enough to help someone else walk forward more clearly. The insurance company's letter arrived early in the week, clean, formal, and stamped in red. The title read, "Notice of Ineligibility for Property Damage Compensation." Amara opened it near midday while reviewing an unrelated case file. In paragraph 2, the reason was clear. No criminal liability established. The incident is classified as a misunderstanding during duty. She wasn't surprised. No one had officially claimed fault. The incident had been framed as a learning experience, and at that level, broken glass, dented metal, chipped paint, and shaken dignity didn't qualify as compensable damage. Her car still sat in the back lot, untouched. She hadn't taken it to a shop, not out of neglect or cost, but because the damage was a reminder. Fixing it too quickly might help others forget that it ever happened. That Friday afternoon, the building's security guard waved her over. "Someone left this for you," he said, pointing to a burgundy car near the brick wall. It was used but in good condition. On the windshield sat an envelope. Inside were car keys and a note, handwritten in slanted script. "This car isn't new, but the person who drives it taught me to look at people differently." She didn't know who had left it. There were no cameras, no witnesses, no signature. The key was in the ignition, and the door was unlocked. This wasn't a gift or apology. It was a quiet gesture, one the system had failed to make. Amara sat in the car, but didn't turn it on. Her hand rested on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the late afternoon sky dipped low. The scent of worn leather and diesel reminded her of her first car, of long drives, and at times she still believed justice lived in written laws. That belief had changed, but something else had taken its place, a quiet, steady understanding that even in a system that failed to say sorry, people could still choose to see and act differently. Life eventually shows us that some things can't be reclaimed by filing a report or amended through policy. Some damage can't be measured by repair bills. Some truths are confirmed only when someone under no obligation chooses to do the right thing, not to prove anything, but simply because they can't not do it. She didn't call the police, didn't notify the finance office. She just folded the small envelope carefully and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk, not to keep it as a souvenir, but as a reminder that in a world where silence is often chosen for safety, some actions, unseen, can't be denied. She never drove the car. It stayed parked in the far lot, where morning light hit the hood through scattered leaves and dust settled a little more each day. There was no official reason, just a quiet sense that the car wasn't meant to be used but to exist, as a mark of something paradoxical yet real, that not all change starts with what's right, but with what won't let you sleep. The person who left the car may have never said a word, but their choice did what dozens of reports could not. It acknowledged. And acknowledgement, even silent, carries weight. She kept the car like she kept an unanswered question, left in plain sight because some acts, when left undone, are wrong. and when done, force others to ask where they truly stand. And sometimes that is the real beginning of a different kind of system. There was no announcement, no farewell meeting, no speech thanking her for her service. That morning, Amara arrived early as usual, brewed a cup of hot tea, opened the windows to let in the soft morning breeze, and quietly placed the letter on her desk, the top right corner marked with the effective date, immediately. 19 months in office. Not long, but not short enough for someone to see clearly how a system survives on mechanical procedures and habitual disregard. She wasn't angry, she wasn't tired, but she knew it was time to step away, not because she couldn't continue, but because what she needed to do next no longer fit within the bounds of a title. No one came to see her off. There was no goodbye gathering. At 8 o'clock, the office ran as it always had. Her colleagues only learned of her departure after reading the end-of-day emails. As for her, she left the room the same way she had once entered it, without a sound. On her desk, she left exactly 2 things: the silver judicial badge, its engraved name worn down from frequent handling, the bottom corner marked with a faint, undefined scratch. To some it might seem like something to replace, but to her it marked the moment when power didn't protect her, yet her choices remained intact. The second was a handwritten note, not typed, not signed, just one line in dark blue ink, leaning slightly to the right. I don't need to be remembered as the right one, just as the one who didn't look away. No one knows who will read the note first. Maybe the cleaning staff, maybe an accountant arriving to inventory the desk, or perhaps a random intern who might understand through one unceremonious line that justice isn't measured by the shine of a title, but by the way someone steps back without asking for anything in return. Amara didn't want a monument. She didn't need a feature article to summarize her term. What mattered most to her wasn't standing tall, but leaving behind one thing worth carrying forward, a line clear enough that someone, someday, when choosing between silence and stepping in, might remember not her name, but her action. Real people don't need statues. They need to be continued, and sometimes, to be continued, the clearest legacy is knowing when to walk away, quietly, without ceremony. The intern entered office 8:12 during a quiet early shift. He had been assigned to review the personnel files of recently departed judges. The room was still, organized, and undisturbed. On the desk lay a silver judicial badge, unwrapped, faded, and placed deliberately in the center. He froze, then carefully picked it up with both hands, sensing it wasn't something to touch lightly. The badge was cold, worn down, its engraving dulled, but the name was familiar. Not from personal contact, but whispered conversations in hallways. She's the one who, always ending in silence, as if her actions spoke for themselves. Sunlight from the window struck the desk, casting a line of light across the badge. It wasn't brighter than usual, but today it meant something more. He didn't know why he stood there so long, only that the badge in his hand and the view outside seemed to hold weight. The sky wasn't remarkable, yet everything felt different, like the room had lost something meaningful and wasn't ready to move on. He hadn't been told to keep it, but he didn't set it down. He read the single line on the handwritten note beside it, nodded slightly, and understood. Some truths don't need explanation, but once felt, they shift how you see the world. He was just an intern with a temporary role, but he knew this moment mattered more than any form or file he'd handled. He left quietly, the badge still in hand, not to claim it, but to carry the memory of that morning, of the light, the silence, and the unspoken message. Some people don't leave behind titles or fanfare. They leave behind direction, and maybe, one day, he would too. The maroon-colored car with its faded paint and intact windshield was moved to the courtyard of a law school in late fall. It arrived the same way it had entered someone's life, quietly, without notice, without the need for acknowledgement. It was placed in a small open area between 2 academic buildings, formerly just a patch of grass that few people visited. No barricades, no sign, no label. No one at the school seemed to know who had brought it. But that morning, it was already parked, wheels locked, Interior clean, no license plate, no paper on the windows, a motionless object waiting to be found. At first, students simply passed by. Some peeked in, noting it wasn't new or flashy, just an old machine worn by time. But slowly, something shifted. They began to pause longer, not because the car was remarkable, but because its presence, unexplained, unapologetic, prompted reflection on things never taught in any law class. No one claimed it was a historic artifact. But to those who had heard fragments of a story about a car smashed not for wrongdoing, but because the person inside didn't look trustworthy, the spot took on a different meaning. Students began sitting near it during breaks. A group held moot court prep sessions nearby. A retired professor paused beside it each morning before class. One evening, someone left a note under the wiper. "Thank you for still being here." Nothing in the car was broken. No shattered glass, no blood, no visible trauma, but there was a chip in the paint near the door handle, a rust line by the rear wheel, a faint dent near the side mirror, small but noticeable if you looked closely. These marks didn't lessen the car's value, they made it clear. You don't need a dramatic wreck to know something once went wrong. By dusk, the courtyard was nearly empty. Light filtered through the thinning trees, casting a soft, quiet glow on the windshield. The last students left the library, their shadows stretching past the car, then fading, like time passing. When the courtyard was nearly empty, 2 children appeared. One was about 10, thin, with braided hair and wearing a school uniform. Beside her was a younger child, maybe 7 or 8, carrying a backpack with a cartoon character and holding tightly to her friend's sleeve. The older one led her friend to the car, stopping in front of it, not too close, not too far. They stood still for a moment, as if waiting for something to be allowed to happen. She raised her hand and pointed to the right-hand door handle, where the paint had chipped and faded over time. "My mom stood right here," she said, her voice steady, not lowered like a secret, nor raised like she needed recognition. "Right here, when people thought she couldn't be trusted." Her friend followed her gaze, then turned to ask with open curiosity, "What did she do?" The question lingered in the near-empty courtyard, hanging for a moment like it was testing its weight. The older child didn't answer right away. She stared at the car again, unblinking, not because she was thinking, but as if remembering something she'd heard many times, but never said aloud. Then she replied, softly but clearly, "He didn't walk away. That's it." There was no further explanation. Nothing else needed to be said. The sentence was complete, not because it contained every detail, but because it held the essential truth. In a world where people turn away for safety, someone chose to stay. The 2 children stood there a while longer. They didn't speak again. The older one placed her hand on the hood, tapped it gently, like adults do when leaving somewhere familiar, and then walked away with her friend, their steps slow but steady, never looking back. Their shadows melted into the evening light, shrinking, then disappearing behind the corridor that led to the school's parking lot. The car remained where it was, unmoving, unshaken, but something had just been added to that space, not in words, not with a plaque, but as a small memory passed from one child to another, like a map with no pictures that still leads people the right way. Because in the end, what remains of someone is not in titles or resumes, but in how others remember them, with 3 simple words: "She didn't walk away." Early Monday morning, the school courtyard was still quiet. Fallen leaves were scattered across the stone benches lining the path to the law school library. The sunlight was soft, not yet warm, but enough to reveal the little things, usually hidden by the rush of the day. A child sat at the edge of a bench, holding an old sketchbook. He was the son of a custodian at the school, often accompanying his mother on early mornings before classes began. While she cleaned the hallway floors, he stayed quietly in the courtyard, never causing trouble, never running around. He liked to watch in silence, sometimes observing adults walk past, watching cars roll through the lot, staring at stones in the grass, and imagining they were distant planets. That morning, as he reached for a leaf that had landed on the bench, His fingers brushed against something hard, a metal badge, tilted slightly to the side as if someone had left it behind. He picked it up. It wasn't heavy, but it was cold and worn. The surface was scratched. The top corner chipped as if it had survived a hard impact, but the engraved words remained clear and unblurred. Federal Judge, United States. He didn't fully understand the meaning of each word, but he knew this wasn't a toy. It didn't look like anything he'd seen at home. He turned it over in his hand, the angled sunlight flashing briefly across the dull surface. It wasn't shiny or beautiful, but something about it made it hard to put down. He glanced around. No one noticed him. The bench sat near the far end of the courtyard, hidden behind two large potted plants. Maybe someone dropped it. Maybe it had been placed there on purpose. He didn't know. But for a moment, it felt like he was holding a piece of a story the adults had forgotten to tell. Something no longer in use, but still holding a part of something once deeply real. He rested the badge in his palm, sitting up straight, his eyes fixed on the distance where the old wine-colored car still sat, unmoved like an unfinished sentence. He had never heard the full story behind the car, only that someone once was not believed, seen as unworthy, unprotected by the system, yet didn't walk away. And now, the badge that had once stood for that justice was in his hand. There was no need for explanation, no label required, just the clarity of those engraved words, enough for a child to look at and quietly wonder, what does it mean to be a judge? Why would someone leave this behind? Why is it chipped but still kept? He didn't know the answers yet, but holding the badge, keeping it in his pocket, not throwing it away, that was the first act. A small one, but the place where every road begins. As the school bell rang to signal the start of the day, the child carefully tucked the badge into his coat pocket and ran toward the hallway where his mother was finishing the last stretch of floor. He reached her, held up the badge, and looked up, voice filled with curiosity, but not fear. "Mom, what is justice?" She paused, her eyes shifting from the mop to her son's face, then to the object he held. Her hand stopped for a beat, not because she didn't recognize it, but because she knew exactly who it had once belonged to. She touched the chipped edge of the badge, looked into her son's eyes, and said, "Justice is when someone like her doesn't stay silent, and people like you don't have to anymore." He looked down at the badge. He didn't fully understand, but he knew this wasn't just something said to end a conversation. She didn't take the badge back. "Keep it," she said. "Not to remember someone, but to remember something." They left the hallway, but the badge stayed in his pocket. Unpolished, unprotected, but heavier than any courtroom praise. Elsewhere, the city moved on. No headlines, no memorials, no statues. No one spoke her name, but the car remained in the law school yard. And somewhere between fading leaves and quiet hours, a belief held firm, kept alive by a child's question and a mother's honest answer. Not carved in stone, not made into slogans, but carried in silence. The badge stayed in his pocket as he entered class. From that moment, something shifted, not in the system, but in how he saw the world. And maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't turn away either. No one carved her name into stone. No speech was given in her honor among the powerful. But in a child's hand, an old silver badge remains. Not for its legal worth, but because it once belonged to someone who refused to turn away when silence seemed safer. The old car sits quietly in a schoolyard, no plaque, no biography, yet enough for someone to pause and learn how to look closer at what was once overlooked. Justice, in the end, does not begin in a courtroom. It begins with someone who holds their gaze long enough for the truth to emerge. And sometimes that alone is enough to make a system rewrite itself, not with a shout, but by standing still at the right moment.